I get really fired up every time I see those posts on LinkedIn, and I just have to like remove myself. I just have to close out of the browser. Otherwise, I'm just like in the comments section, making a fool out of myself.
It's clickbait, Andy.
I know.
It's totally clickbait. Yeah.
I'm like, I got a job to do.
I know. Right?
Here's what go-to-market teams are missing: proof. That's what I think of every morning when I fire up LinkedIn and scroll through boring manifestos and endless lukewarm takes. Opinions are cheap and proof is gold. I'm Mark Huber, and this is The Proof Point, a show from UserEvidence that helps go-to-market teams find ideas, get frameworks, and swap tactics. Each episode includes an unfiltered discussion with the biggest names in B2B SaaS to help find the proof points that I'm in search of. You'll learn from sales, marketing, and customer success leaders in the trenches, where I ask them, seriously, what actually works for you? One of our guests actually told me this felt like we were having drinks at a bar and talking about work without all the BS. And that pretty much sums it up and why I'm so excited for this new show. Join us every other week for new episodes. Hot takes, always welcome. On today's episode of The Proof Point, we went in on competitive intelligence, somewhat of a niche function in the B2B SaaS world, but it's having a bit of a come up. And we talked with a few people who know so much more about CI than I do. First up, we had Andy McCotter-Bicknell, head of competitive intel at Apollo, and somebody who I have admired from afar for a while now, and he's way taller in person. I got to meet him at Spring last April. Next up, Clara Smyth. She's a director of competitive enablement services at Klue. She has been in the CI space for a long time. Not going to tell you how long. She tells you on the episode, but she knows a ton about this, and she's good people. And last, but definitely not least, Alex Eaton, our director of product marketing at UserEvidence. He does everything under the sun as it relates to product marketing, CI being one of those things here. And it was a really fun conversation. Can't wait for you to listen. Enjoy. So Andy, why don't you kick us off here and get on your soapbox? You're encouraged to stay on as long as you want.
So let me just start by saying, I think that a lot of companies are sleeping on investing in competitive intelligence functions, like just within their entire company. And there's a couple of reasons why I think that. Number one, I think it's because just tactically, they can't just like attach a competitive intel person to a specific project. And they think about them more as like an analyst or somebody to just like give them information. And I think it could be totally like positioned as a very fluffy job where you're just kind of like telling people like what to do, almost like a consultant. Whereas the best competitive intel practitioners actually get their hands dirty and they are jumping in and actually helping different projects like cross the finish line. They're adding in a lot of their expertise within a specific field, and they're trying to actually tie a lot of the outcomes to stuff that like customers are actually interested in. And then number two, I think it's just like an ignorance thing, especially founder CEO types. Obviously, they're very bullish on like what they're offering, but also like to the point, I think, where they think that nobody else can really deliver in the way that they can. And in reality, especially over the past few years, like you can tell on G2, you can tell on like the Martech 5000 or any of these like big landscapes, like the number of tools, especially in software, it's just growing exponentially. It's crazy. Like it's like 10%, 20% growth every single year. And so you can't just assume that you're the only tool or option out there for a specific buyer anymore in a specific category. You have alternatives, and it's not just the status quo. It's not just like an Excel spreadsheet or something like that. Like you have multiple direct competitors, you have multiple adjacent competitors, and you have to get in and understand how to position yourself to actually stand out properly. And so that's like what competitive intel practitioners can actually help people do. A lot of people are just underinvesting. They don't really understand, again, how to place the person within their org. And they also don't think that they really need somebody to tell them that they are different or that they need to be placed in a specific place in a buyer's mind. Like they think that they're super unique anyway.
So I have a hilarious question that Andy and Clara, you can answer first, and then Alex, you can do the same because it applies to all three of you, but Andy and Clara have competitive intel on their name. So how do you two tell your parents like what you do for work? Because I feel like competitive intel is just defined in so many different ways.
Yeah, I would say I start with like, how can you explain it to your grandma, right? How can you do it in a one-liner? And my one-liner is that I am an in-house CIA analyst, right? Just like an analyst would do it for the government, this is what I do for my internal stakeholders, which are the company. But Honestly, that's a little bit fluffy and it's making me look better than I am. And so to the regular B2B SaaS marketer, I'll say, I am that person that triages intelligence that comes in so that we can win one more deal with that intelligence. So it's that triage engine. And for me, like fun story, my dad didn't go to college. He's a craftsman. And so I always tell him the CIA analogy just so he can get really excited and super proud of me. But in reality, people in business really understand it as that triage engine. So you can clean and calibrate intel coming in and make sure it gets into the hands to actually make the right decisions and to close one more deal.
Not that I was expecting a bad answer, but the whole CIA analogy makes it sound way cooler.
Oh, totally.
That is a way more in-depth answer than I give my parents, Clara. Let me just say, like, I need to steal that. Like, I try to like keep my responses like to a bare minimum so I don't confuse anyone, so that I don't like make too many like metaphors. Like, I have to like legitimately like pull myself back and be like, I just do like marketing stuff. That's like what I say to like normies. I pretty much stick to like marketing for tech company and I leave it at that. But then like I do have somebody who like is in like software or something like that, then I'm usually able to dive in a bit deeper and be like, I specialize in understanding just like who all like the competitive threats are for our company, our product. And then I just try to inform our product, marketing, sales teams about those threats so they can win more.
All right, Alex, what do you say? Because you probably can't say that you worked in the CIA.
If I had to explain to someone in my family competitive part specifically, I'd probably make a reference to like rival high schools I played against back in the day. It's our game plan to beat Cathedral or Center Grove, which were like high schools I competed against in Indiana, been playing football or whatever. And that would be in there. I'm like, oh, okay, it's just your game plan. So I have to go back in the day though, for sure, and make it nostalgic.
I love that, Alex. Yeah, I think for me, I've been beating the compete drum for over 10 years. So I think my family is just totally sick of me. But you can tell what kind of nerd I am. And Andy, totally, you're right. Different people bumping into you at the bar or at a conference or on the street, very different answers. But yeah, at the highest level, we do marketing, we do positioning. At the most specific level, we're that CIA analyst for in-house.
So Clara, maybe get us started because you've been doing CI for a while. How do you define competitive intelligence?
Yeah, how I define competitive intelligence, Mark, is the collection, aggregation, and also sharing of unique data that comes into the company, right? So there's a couple ways you can slice and dice this data. It's either market, competitor, which is really the most well-known and polarizing and exciting one. And then there's customer intelligence as well. And so for me, I would say it's those types of intelligence that come together that can impact a company's direction and response to the market.
It's funny too, because I think that there's like so much of an overlap, at least I'm seeing it now, more so than like the past few years, but there's almost like an overlap over like between competitive intel and customer marketing in a way. I'm finding myself really collabing with our customer marketing team over at Apollo a lot more, just like for testimonials, for like customer quotes and stories, but also like just from like a win-loss perspective, like understanding like what their experience was leading into like actually purchasing Apollo over something else, or like just like some of the pain points that they were feeling, or like what specifically like Apollo solved for them, different use cases and whatnot. And so I think that's a big misconception, I think. And it's probably like a positioning thing for competitive intel in general, that like you're just thinking about competitors. Whereas like it's a pretty even like split 50-50 between competitors and customers, and just trying to understand like really like what is it that you're up against and who is it that you are trying to sell to, like who is the customer at the end of the day. So I'm trying to beat the drum on as much as possible, like how important understanding the customer is as well.
Oftentimes you'll find your differentiator in a way that us marketers wouldn't have been able to say it right directly from that. And then whether that's something you use in a marketing campaign or whether that's some feedback you take back to products directly, whatever it is, that often can be that different thing that we just get stuck in marketing land and jargon and thinking of that breaks through. So I think that's super important.
Yeah, you nailed it, Alex. I think one thing that will humble execs and prove them wrong is the voice of the customer, right? It's understanding why you lost that deal literally with a snippet from Gong from them, right? Or however you want to get that type of intelligence. But to Andy's point, the way that you look at the market and the way that you get humbled from the market is actually through customers, right? And it's customers' testimonials. And so when we rank like the types of intelligence based on value, there's so many sources of intelligence, but the customer driven and the customer provided intelligence is just so high grade. And that will move your needle on if you're going to win or not win the deal, just like Alex said, in terms of being that differentiator.
That's like the my favorite kind of presentation to give to execs too. It's like the win-loss or like the qualitative feedback behind some kind of like buying decision. I know for a fact, like there's not like really any like opinions that can like push that away or like, you know what I mean? Like it's like, that's what it is. And usually you're highlighting something. If you're doing a pretty comprehensive program, then you're going to be like highlighting a lot of different things that your leadership team probably isn't aware of. I always feel super excited to share insights like that.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, it's the blind spots. It's like, what's going to burn your CEO? What's going to burn through your cash? What's going to burn the board? And now I sound really dramatic being from New Jersey and everything.
Burn it down.
Burn it down to the ground. But really, it's about blind spots, right? Who did you not see coming? What's going to hurt your bottom line? That's why I use the word burn. It's all about blind spots and how can you give them unique data, back to your point, Mark, of like, how do you define it? It's really who needs it and what are you going to do about it, honestly.
I feel like when non-CI people hear competitive intelligence, the first thing that comes to mind is battle cards. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't think it's a bad thing because it at least puts like a placement of like one value that a CI person can bring to an organization. At least we have that placement in somebody's head. Because I think if you asked somebody like what CI is, like maybe like 7-8 years ago, people would have no idea like what you're talking about. So now at least we have that like mental real estate where it's like, okay, like battle cards. We can do better than battle cards, I think, just to be clear. But at least we have that like mental real estate where people like understand kind of what we do. I think if you ask this question again in 10 years, hopefully like assuming things are like trending in the right direction, we can continue to like really make a high impact on different companies that we work for, it'll be more than just battle cards, because I know for a fact that the really great CI folks do significantly more than battle cards. And so, yes, I think it's fine. Just like the first place to start, in the same way that like product marketers, like the first thing that you think of is probably like product launches, but they do so much more than that. That's my take. I'm curious what you think, Clara.
The war analogies in competitive intelligence are far and wide, and it's definitely old school. But to Andy's point, it is that rallying cry. It's the anchor of similarity, right? When people say battle cards, okay, I know what you're talking about. But if it's limited to only that, you got a problem. Where yes, battle cards are the number one known deliverable, but that actual content can take many forms. It can take a form of a quick dismiss of what a seller needs to win against Alex Eaton, right, on the battlefield of soccer, whatever sport you played, Alex. It can take an executive presentation form. It can take a win-loss readout form. It can take a product differentiation launch strategy form. And so to your point, Mark, battle card's a good anchor point, but the derivative versions of it is where it gets really exciting and really creative.
As someone who has done them just as a part of my broader product marketing role, it's always been most useful either for new salespeople who are joining the company and learning the industry, or for figuring out if you need to actually retrain and unlearn something from an experienced sales team. It's like doing the opposite. Because it's always, you start with like the key baseline information or maybe a couple points of differentiation, and kind of your place in the market is like how I use those, is like, all right, here's what it all looks like, and here's kind of where we fit with each. But then it's kind of becomes just that jumping off point of like, if you have an experienced salesperson you're working with, there's someone you're helping out with that, you have to get a level deeper with like, how are we actually speaking to this particular thing in a deal? But then for those new folks who are coming on and onboarding, I think they're super valuable for that initial, you can control that overview they get of the entire landscape and what it looks like.
The one thing that I think is really important to keep in mind is that whether we like it or not, as CI practitioners, we're always judged on the quality of our battle cards. I would say probably first and foremost, because it's like the most accessible. And like you mentioned, Mark, it's like a lot of people just like think about battle cards first and foremost. When you think of CI, we might take part in a lot of really impactful things. But if somebody jumps into a battle card and it's kind of junky or out of date, then they're going to immediately judge the quality of the rest of the entire program, because it's just like that fundamental thing that people automatically think of. The side of CI that I think we're trying to move forward and elevate, like Clara has mentioned, like a lot of like different things that like a CI practitioner can do beyond battle cards, but it's still important to like meet the moment and really deliver above and beyond like what people expect already. You could be doing like a bunch of really cool things on the side, but if you're not creating like really high quality, up-to-date battle cards, then you're going to be kind of questioned, and like the value is going to be less so across the entire org because you're going to not have that much visibility. People aren't going to be looking to you for insights. They're not going to be like looking at you to bring your value into other projects. And so all those other things are important, but get the battle cards right.
And just like Andy said, if you don't meet that moment, if you're not open enough and have what I call like a content governance approach to it, right? What is your model to evolving your content with the market and with internal sources and with validation from your buyers? Then it's just yet another lame piece of content, right? And Mark, and I know you've talked about this on your previous podcast with April Dunford, right? The poo-poo polisher. I know that's going to sound really random to people who had not listened to that episode, but to your point, it's like, do you just come back to it, once every 3 months just to brush it off? Or is this an evolving piece of content where you could also raise your hand to the selling organization and say, hey, we have a gap and we need your help to help fill this gap. I call it a Intel gap map. I do a lot of consulting companies. And so of course I have my lame frameworks and super funny analogies, but yeah, imagine like your Intel gap map on your battle cards. You're not coming in 100% hot, but you know where the gaps are so that you can enlist people to actually help fill those in.
So Clara, you actually did not realize this, but why I was typing just now is because what you said, battle cards do not equal a competitive intelligence program. That is going to be the title of this episode. So you nailed it. It won't be on a billboard, but it'll be on the title of this. So I do a lot of prep for these whenever we record and try and research who's going to be on the episode and then just look to see what's going on in the LinkedIn echo chamber that we sometimes love, but mostly hate. And one of the things that I found multiple people say was that you should ignore your competition. Don't waste any time paying attention to what your competitors are doing and listen to your customers instead. Where do you all stand on that?
I just don't think it's realistic. I think anyone is saying that they don't is lying to themselves, to be honest. Like, look at a company like Apple, who is all about doing their own thing and whatever. They were the most locked into being cooler than Microsoft, even in the old days, than anyone. Even the coolest, most insular, tech-forward companies, like self-focused brand companies, are still locked into how they compare or where they sit in the market in general. Like, you have to know, because that's how you're different. I think there's a point to where you can focus way too much and be a follower, which is where it gets dangerous. But I would argue that the vast majority of companies are not there.
Clara, what do you think?
Yeah, this is a juicy one, Mark. For me, it comes back to, where is your revenue being lost, right? Where is your competitors stealing your rev share and your market share? And that is continuously happening, whether you think it's not or if it is, right? And so to Alex's point, I've heard a lot of phrases like customer obsessed, but competitor aware, or competitor obsessed, but customer aware. And, in my experience, when I've looked at the companies that I've worked for, they have to kind of break new ground in terms of their roadmap that is customer obsessed, right? And customer rotated and focused on. But if you're losing 20 deals this month to an unknown competitor that you haven't monitored, is that even going to offset each other, right? And so for me, it's all about rev share stealing. Again, I have my intense analogies in this episode, but who's like eating your lunch, really? And if you ignore that, you're going to have a bigger problem at the board level.
I love that you said customer obsessed. And I say that because within the last, at the time of this recording, like a week, he just locked in another episode about debunking customer obsession and how people and companies who say customer obsession are usually not practicing it. And we're going to have Jill Rowley, who's a massive deal with Mark Organ, and then Evan Huck. So we'll have to share that with you. But yeah, that hits home with me.
What Clara and Alex both said makes a ton of sense. And it kind of ties back to what I was mentioning earlier too. Like, I think that, to be honest, a lot of competitive intel practitioners, like, their jobs are like dual 50% competitors, 50% customer intelligence. You really can't have like one over the other in order to have like a really solid program in place. In the LinkedIn world, I think there are like these like small like little platitudes that like you hear from like a really big famous like CEO, and then you take it as like gospel, essentially. Like, I think that's like a Jeff Bezos thing, or like some other like multi-trillionaire like said something like that. And so like now it's time for every single SaaS company to think that same way. And the reality is, unless you're also building like this like monopoly game-changing company, that doesn't really make sense to think that way. Because again, at the end of the day, whether you like it or not, there's plenty of direct competitors to what you offer. And unless you understand deeply what else your customers are considering or evaluating, you're not going to be able to stand out. You're not going to be able to differentiate. You could say, oh, well, like, I'll just listen to like what my customers say. But like at the end of the day, they're going to tell you like a lot of the same stuff that they'll tell anybody else. Like, I want it a little bit faster. It'd be cool if I had this feature that this other company has. You need to be able to truly understand what else is out there so that you can make legitimate differentiations, like completely net new features or capabilities that nobody else is offering that like your customers aren't going to spoon feed to you. And so that's what goes into and like what's missing from that conversation. I get really fired up every time I see those posts on LinkedIn, and I just have to like remove myself. I just have to close out of the browser. Otherwise, I'm just like in the comment section making a fool out of myself.
It's clickbait, Andy.
I know.
It's totally clickbait. Yeah.
I'm like, I got a job to do. I got
my
a full-time
final comment. I know. Right? What you were saying about like customers leading the way, I would say that like if you have customers in the market, amazing. Those customers are probably inundated with a lot of different choices and also a lot of confusing buying experiences. And so what I would say to any company is if you don't have competitors, you have a bigger problem, right? You're trying to maybe create this new category that you're spearheading, but in reality, if it's not validated or funded by the market, you have a bigger problem here, right? And so for me, I see competitors as a great thing. And I know Andy's posted about this before on LinkedIn, where it's a validation. And also if you get additional funding rounds, it's just great for everybody. It brings up all the boats on the ship.
That's so true though, because that's something we run into a bit at UserEvidence. And we're in MarTech, which is 14,000, the number that just came out of the amount of vendors in it. And while we have less direct head-to-head competitors, there's a lot of competitors for particular parts, but it's not status quo really that we compete against. It's the 14,000 other vendors competing for the same budget. That budget isn't going bigger because the amount of vendors are going bigger. There's also a point of it where you have to prove out your problem is more worth solving before you even have to prove that your product is the right choice. And that is a huge challenge that you have to tackle.
I'm pumped for this next question because I think the three of you will probably end up schooling me on this. So I feel like the default answer when people are just dipping their toes in the CI waters and don't have a ton of experience is to always look externally for competitive intel. Where are you looking for competitive intel when you're doing your homework?
Again, it depends on like what you're going out and looking for. Sometimes you'll be asked like, hey, how does our product compare to theirs? Really tactically, like you can go and like find like release notes, knowledge centers, and like it's very straightforward. I probably don't need to like dive too deeply into that. But in a lot of cases, what people are trying to understand is like, why are we winning? Why are we losing? And that's when you really like lean in a little bit more like on the customer and the buyer side. You put together win-loss programs. You talk with your sales team. You try to understand like what they're hearing from the field. And so it's like this very much like, what do we have? What do they have? And how can we be honest about like what we have and like message and position ourselves relative to those truths? But then you also have like, how do other people perceive us? And how do they perceive the competitors as well? And that's where you really need to like dive in and like really try to put together a more like cohesive narrative of the landscape and make sure that everybody within the organization is bought into that.
That's one really bad conception of intel is that you get it in an unethical way. But in reality, to Andy's point, it really depends on which team you're serving and partnering with, right? Like Andy said, with release notes or knowledge bases or PRs or easily scrapable pieces, what I have found is that the most valuable intel is actually the most expensive or time intensive to get, right? And so, for example, like Andy was talking about with win-loss data, whether you're doing it in-house or you're going through an external firm, that's going to take a lot of time and dedication and engagement with your external buyer. But that's gold, right? That's diamond, platinum, gold across the board. You can't get that anywhere else. But then if you go to kind of lower, you can do internal, Slack posted posts from your market and also from your buyers. And then gong calls are also up there, right? So if you look at reviews, if you look at gong calls, if you look at win-loss, those are the top intel sources that I've seen as most effective. But you bring up another point, Mark, which is intel that's externally focused or internally focused. And that's another rabbit hole. I don't know if we want to go down. Alex, I wonder if you have a spicy take around internal versus external intel.
Well, before we kick it over to Alex, this is the podcast to go down rabbit holes and whatever other analogies you want to use, Clara. So yes, Alex, give us your take and then we'll crawl back into that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a product marketing specific take, but I am looking at what competitors are trying to do or trying to be, whether that's working or not. A lot of that is positioning on the website, or if we can get a hold of sales materials, whatever that is. But it's interesting because it kind of gives you a view in the strategy of where they're trying to go, or is there a particular industry they're focusing on, or something that they are pushing really hard from a specific product perspective. And that could be new words for categories. That could mean a lot of different things. But I like looking at that. Whether or not it's working is something you have to figure out for yourself separate from that. But I think that gives a good sense of what in their own heads each competitor is trying to do. And that's what I like to dig into and pull from.
The next interesting piece too, on top of that, is whether or not like their customers are also like repeating that same language. Like if they're repeating that like category, the competitors like trying to put together, if they're like talking about the big features that the competitor is like really pushing. I think that's also really telling of not just like what the competitor is trying to do, but also if like their customers and users, if they're like along for the ride, or if they're like, dude, like, what are you talking about? I just use you for data. You know what I mean? Like that happens all the time. Like in a go-to-market space that Apollo is in, there's like some very like straightforward use cases. And then there's some very much like pie in the sky type of like positioning or category creation that's trying to take place. And you can tell very clearly what's working and what's not based on what the customers and users are actually like repeating back out in the ether and LinkedIn and like the different communities. It's fun to kind of bounce those off of each other and kind of see what's sticking.
One thing that I always get really excited about is calling ourselves like the competitive enablement platform. Is like, how do you enable one more seller to close one more competitive deal to impact the bottom line? And when I've seen the word competitive enablement in job descriptions, it makes my day, right? There was recently a big job description that was posted for, a senior director of CI, and that was a core component. I've also seen actual titles like that. And so that's an example of how Klue's gone to market in terms of what the narrative is, as we've really changed hearts and minds around that. And another topic, Andy and Alex, that I'd love to go down yet another rabbit hole around is what a competitive narrative is, because that's different than market creation. That's different than category creation. That's how you put out to the market, just like Andy was saying. And if you can get your buyers to say that, then you've won against the competition.
All right. Asking for a friend. What's a competitive narrative?
2 companies ago, there was this concept of how do we get everybody on the same page with an elevator pitch, right? How does thousands and thousands of sellers know exactly what to say when XYZ competitor comes up? Or if it's a set of competitors, that's not even worth name dropping, right? If it's our tier 3 competitors versus tier 2 versus tier 1. And so overall, it's that overarching message around the competitors and how do we respond as a company and how do we differentiate around that?
So you mentioned naming competitors, and I've got a fun little story about this, but I'll tell that later. Andy, you wrote a post about this recently about CEOs and founders who don't want to name competitors. So without rehashing the entire post, why do you think CEOs and founders aren't naming competitors whenever they're positioning themselves?
Some founders will say anything to not say competitor or to name a competitor. They'll be like, oh, no, we have like alternatives. There are substitutions, but call it what it is. And at the end of the day, I think it's also like a piece where there's like some really old advice where if you name a competitor, then you're just going to give them like airspace. You're going to like give them more attention than they need. And whether we like it or not, if you're evaluating software, if someone's evaluating software, the first thing they're going to do is say like software alternatives. They'll Google these things, and those are things that they're going to do anyway. And so if you're not out there creating content to help answer that question, then you're going to essentially leave it up to third parties, like, different like kind of publications, which could be very much pay to play, or you're leaving it up to your competitors to list out that kind of positioning, which you also don't want. And so it's much better to get out there and really explain how you position yourself against very specific competitors, unless, and there's a big unless, you are the de facto category leader. That's something that I also learned from April Dunford And it totally makes sense. Like Salesforce, it wouldn't make sense for them to have like a bunch of pages about like Salesforce versus HubSpot, Salesforce versus Pipedrive. In the same way that like back in the old days, like IBM like wouldn't be creating like the ad against Apple. But, if you're like an up and comer, you need to like attach yourself to some of these bigger players that naturally like have much more brand dominance. And there's really no downside to doing that. That's my take on that topic.
Andy, hot take on top of that is, you've made it when a company like Salesforce actually names that competitor. So for all intents and purposes, I saw the other day on LinkedIn that Shopify and a great friend of mine who works over there had posted a video interviewing a customer of why they are no longer Salesforce customers, right? And then I look on Salesforce's website and they're like, well, this is the Salesforce landing page against Shopify. So now you have two different landing pages, one Shopify versus Salesforce, the other Salesforce versus Shopify. And the buyer's like, where do I start with this? But again, like Andy said, and like I heard at the Spring Conference, Mark, I know you were there as well. One of the speakers was sharing how when a buyer comes to you, they already have a short list. You are already on the short list, right? And so are you helping them or are you confusing them? And to Andy's point is like, if you're not ready with your differentiation talk track and your different consulting motions and your landing pages and your why, buy, us, et cetera, you're going to be on the back foot. And that's for me why CI just needs to have its own function, because if you don't have it, you're 1,000% on the back foot.
Alex, what's your take on this?
That last part Clara said is like the key to me, is you have to at least have a POV. Like it's worse to not have a POV than to have one. I love comparison pages. I've seen the conversions go crazy on them. Like they work and people are looking for them. I also think because everyone knows that you are going to be a bit of a biased perspective from your own company, right? They're not expecting that. There is actually a ton of opportunity to be different or to build brand on those pages because of that. They come in expecting that biased experience. So there are different ways, whether it's brutal honesty or calling out something that you don't do as well, or just being quirky with your brand, with copywriting. There are a lot of ways that you can stand out on a page like that in particular. The other piece I really love about what Clara said was the consulting motion. And that to me speaks to the fact that there's so much more than just product for how you can beat a competitor. And I've been at companies before where we have won big deals purely because our salespeople were amazing to work with. We had a great brand and they had such a different experience between salespeople, between the competitors, that it completely threw them off in another direction. And I think that's really empowering for different teams as well. And something that people should be paying more attention to is not just products or differentiators or what's on the marketing site, but the actual like consultative experience. And what is it like for them to talk to you? How does that go? How do they feel during that conversation beyond just what features you have? That I think is a super underappreciated part of the competitive world.
So my fun story on comparison pages was from my last company. And Andy, I think we talked about this page a while back when I did it, but there was a lot of mud being thrown our way at my last company from a particular competitor that ironically enough is being dragged through the mud on LinkedIn these days. So it is, karma kind of comes back to you. But what we did was we talked to mutual customers that we had who used both products because they truly were used for different purposes and they were more complementary of each other than they were truly direct competitors. So on that comparison page, we named them. I got a lot of inspiration from, I think it was the OG like intercom page, or maybe it was the Drift intercom page back in the day, shouted out what they were good at and gave them credit where credit was due and tried to educate people on, hey, this is the space that company operates in, and this is how we complement what they do. We're not going at them. And it landed really well because we had 3 mutual customers that I got very pointed testimonials for. And it landed so well that my then CEO got a call from their CEO demanding that we take the page down. My then CEO asked, was any of it inaccurate? And the other CEO said, no. So we kept it up.
And you went about it in a really similar way too with UserEvidence as well. I love that framework that you set. Anybody can really adopt that. You can talk about like your strengths over the competitors' strengths over you, like your product, which kind of like eases, I think, a lot of people's minds quite a bit. Like it makes them feel like you're not quite as biased maybe as even though we very much are. But then you also include a ton of like customer proof to kind of showcase the proof behind like what you're actually saying. And there's a ton of different ways that you can go about like a competitive landing page. At the end of the day, you should have something up if you're not like the de facto category leader. It's just really all about like the way that you deliver that information.
Yeah, you nailed it, Andy. And to make sure that you know the customer better, you know their use case better, you know how they go to market better. And that I think can be extended throughout the sales cycle, just like Alex said, right? Because the experience that they go through is the differentiation, right? Compared to the competitors. And there's actually agencies out there that do this professionally. Competitive landing pages are a thing. They definitely are out there because this is such an area that nobody really knows how to do. And so for me, it's like, how do we make sure to anchor on the customer use case as the biggest TLDR here and be really classy along the way, right, Mark?
Yeah, you got to take the high road. So last question here, and I'm genuinely pumped for this because I do not know how to measure what I'm about to ask. So one of the things that I always try to do at the end of recording episodes on the Proof Point is trying to ask people, well, how do you know if you're on the right track? How do you know if you have some of those solid proof points that you're doing something well? So maybe we'll go around the room here. How do you measure the impact of competitive intel? Looking at maybe early leading indicators and then lagging indicators too.
Win rate, right? That's the easiest one. You do have to be on top of your team for measurement to make sure they're actually doing it. And like there are levels to that usefulness. It's more useful if you're focused on one or two, I found as well, or like trying to affect it over a particular time. But if for more like early indicators, there's also interest that I think is interesting. Like if we have, for example, competitive landing pages and we're trying to figure out what to focus on, which ones are getting visited a lot, that can start to lead you towards, okay, this is an up and coming competitor. We should focus on this more. Then look at win rate, then look at some of these other things during the deal cycle that we can focus on. So you can gauge interest before the impact of it, which I think is really interesting. For me, the thing I've used the most to try and figure out if there's a problem is win rate at the end of the day.
Yeah, I will have to disagree with that one, Alex. I think win rate is really tricky. I mean, it's a good North Star. It hurts nobody to run after a good win rate and to influence good win rate. On my end, though, I found that there's so many different factors that play into win rate, right? There's pricing, there's product, there's the human side, there's, of course, competitive. And of course, if we can move the competitive muscle within that win rate, then that is what is in our sphere of control. So I agree, but disagree. And so I do think that is a North Star, though, that a lot of people like to anchor on. It just depends on how well you're working with other teams that also influence win rate as well. To piggyback on what you said, Alex, I think I am constantly learning, being humbled by, and being innovated by the customers that I consult each and every day at Klue. And so this is the number one thing that they come to me for, which is how do we report and roll up these successes to the board, to execs? What does our board pack look like around competitive programming and win-loss rates, to Alex's point? And so for me, there's a couple ways that you can look at this. You can look at it from content engagement. You can look at this from influence revenue. You can look at this from user engagement, right? Around who's actually using your content, the content governance piece, right? The special projects that you support. But for me, the North Star has always been revenue impact. And I bet my career time and time again on revenue impact for CI for Rev Gen teams, and then Rev Gen teams supporting CI for that unique data coming back.
I very much want to piggyback off of Clara. Alex, I was on the same page as you until I realized like, oh, okay, cool. I'm like responsible for win rate, but then like I'm one guy. This is when I was working for Zoom Info. And so like the competitive intel manager is going to be responsible for win rate, not the sales team, not the customer success. You know what I mean? There are so many factors. And so it just led to like, okay, let's level set a little bit more. And it went down to like, okay, like what are some of the other inputs that I can specifically control? I can control the confidence that our sales team has against competitors. That's really important because that's going to totally impact win rate at the end of the day. I can impact how often people are referencing enablement materials related to competitors. So those are some like inputs that like the buck stops with me. If it's not very good, then like, yeah, I'm not doing my job. That's one piece. And I think that's important like for every competitive intel practitioner to like be thinking about. The other piece too, that I think if you're not looped in, is probably not great. Competitive intel is a team sport. Kind of like what Clara was mentioning, like you need to also be looped into like what other teams are working on as well. Not dissimilar to like what product marketers are typically gold on, which is like the successful launch of a product, which could be like activation or adoption increase, something along those lines of a specific product line. I don't see a reason why a competitive intel practitioner shouldn't also be gold on the same success. Because at the end of the day, like, what are you contributing to? It's not just like to make sure that sales is enabled. It's to make sure that like a product is differentiated. It's to make sure that like the messaging is like really resonating with your target audience. And unless you're gold on those things, then you're not going to get looped into those other channels as well, or those other teams, those other initiatives. Yes, I think it's really important to have some of those individual competitive intel metrics to be like judged on, but you also need to like be aligned with a couple of other more team specific goals just to make sure that you're like looped in. They're properly taking in competitive intel through like the entirety of their project as well. And that can be like product launches. It can be research projects. It can be like acquisitions. There's really like no limit, but you know, whatever's important to the organization, try to tie to that.
Yeah, you nailed it, Andy. I was on another podcast recently and we were talking about like, where does the soul of competitive intelligence live within the organization? Like, who do you answer to? And that also comes back to the ever questionable topic, which is where should CI live within an organization? We'll save that for another podcast, Mark. But the TLDR here, just like Andy said, is it depends on where your soul lives within the organization, where you can make the greatest impact. And also know that CI is more of an art than a science, right? Like you are triaging all this intel that comes in, you're contextualizing it and you're pushing it to product. You're making M&A acquisitions, just like Andy said. You're influencing the board level and you're making sure that sales wins. And so it's a lot to handle, but it's also important to be ruthless around prioritizing what you're not going to do so you get that one more head count, right? So it's a good problem to have, just like Andy said.
This was a blast. The three of you schooled me a whole lot on CI. I think I might be analogied out. So Clara, we'll have to save a few for the next time we have you on a podcast, but this was so good. I appreciate you all coming on the Proof Point.